Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Moondrop KATO, which is Moondrop's latest single dynamic driver earphone, their replacement to the KXXS. And as a replacement to the KXXS, it's priced appropriately. It's around 190 bucks. And you might also be thinking, it looks like it's in the same chassis. And yeah, that's kind of the same chassis and shell that we've seen with the KXXS, the Starfield, and the Aria. And I think with good reason, a lot of people are kind of concerned about that. Just because, the KXXS, the Aria, and the Starfield, they all kind of sound about the same. They're not really moving things on. And so I think there's some concerns about the KATO, and I share these concerns. Is this really going to be a step forward or kind of more of the same? And this is where typically I would tease you a little bit, but I'll just go ahead and say right up front, I think this is actually a step forward for Moondrop. In fact, I think this is Moondrop's best single dynamic driver earphone yet. And so in this video, we'll talk about why. I'm going to start by just kind of going over the build quality and the physical stuff, which, yeah, there is a lot in common with the other earphones, but then we'll talk about the sound, and then we'll talk about these versus some of my favorite single dynamic driver earphones around this price range, including the Tangent Hana 2021, the JVC FDX1, and then the new Dunu Falcon. But yeah, this is a live review, like all my other reviews. So if you're here live, you have any questions about the KATO that I don't answer in the review, please do drop your questions in the live chat. And at the end of the review, we'll have a little back and forth conversation where hopefully I can answer all of your burning questions. But I guess otherwise, just a quick shout out to Hi-Fi Go for sending this in for review. And without further ado, let's dive to the table and take a look at the Moondrop KATO, or Kato, maybe is probably how I should be saying it, but I keep saying KATO in my head, and that's going to be hard for me to change, so we'll just stick with KATO for now, and I hope you will forgive me. But yeah, let me give it the old roadie wrap so you can take a look at how this thing winds up. There you go. Not a bad look for a $190 earphone. But yeah, let's do a quick tour of what we get inside the box in case you missed my earlier unboxing video. This is the box. You got your Moondrop character on the front, which is nice art, frankly. And yeah, but otherwise, what do we get inside the box? So they do include this little carry case, which of all the Moondrop carry cases that I've gotten with different earphones, this one is actually my favorite. I actually got basically the same carry case with my Moondrop Stardust that I had to import. And it's like the right size. It's got a magnetic clasp. The IMs fit in there kind of barely. Like it's perfect. I think this is kind of my ideal carry case for a set of IMs. In addition to that, of course, you get multiple sets of ear tips. Here, Moondrop has included a full set, small, medium, large, of their foam ear tips, which, to be frank, I haven't used these. But they also include small, medium, large of these new, they call them spring ear tips. This is a new ear tip that Moondrop made, I think, for the KATO. And supposedly they're going to be selling these things separately, which frankly, I'm actually kind of excited about because I think the spring tips on here are actually pretty nice. Maybe let's dive in a little bit more. You'll notice I'm missing a pair here because I've got a pair on the KATO and then I've got a pair here, but there's actually a third pair that I've actually put on my JVC FDX1 because I really do quite like the fit of these little ear tips. They are, I don't know what to say about them. They've just got a nice texture to the silicone, kind of similar to something like a spin fit ear tip, which is pretty nice. And then they are, as you can kind of see, they're actually a little bit on the short side. Kind of remind me of something like a TWS ear tip, which is interesting. I don't know that these ear tips are going to fit that great on earphones that don't have a notch on the nozzle. And maybe that's a good time to mention the nozzles here. And it's actually unique that they actually have a notch on them because not all Moondrop ear tips, or sorry, nozzles have notches on them. In fact, most of them don't have a notch. And I do think that notch will be kind of necessary to holding these tips on just because of how they're designed. And I don't know, it's not that interesting. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I guess it was a good way to transition over here to the nozzles, which it's interesting that Moondrop included these tuning nozzles. They'll call them tuning nozzles. And supposedly the metal that they're made of is actually what the difference is. These ones are brass. The other nozzles that I have on here, the default ones, are stainless steel. And when I measured them in just like the frequency response of them, which you can check on squig.link, link in the description down below. When I measured them, the frequency response, there actually was a bit of a difference that showed up here with the brass nozzles. It seemed to show that there was actually a little bit more sort of those air frequencies. But to be perfectly honest, in listening experience, they sounded the same to me. So I stuck with just the stock ones just to, I guess, be sure that I was getting the stock original sound. But to be perfectly honest, like the whole nozzle swapping thing on here, not that useful in my opinion. They did also include this little carry case, which is interesting because they also included this carry case. I'm not sure why. I guess you could have a case specifically for your nozzles. Maybe that's what that's about. I don't know. But you do get that. But otherwise, you get the earphone and the cable. And I guess let's talk about this cable. To be perfectly honest, this is actually one of my favorite, well, not just one of my favorite Moondrop cables. I think I could fairly safely say this is my favorite cable that's come with a Moondrop earphone. But this is actually just, frankly, one of my favorite pack-in cables. It's a handsome looking cable. Like, it looks nice. It's got a nice thickness to it. Maybe a little bit on the stiff and somewhat memory prone side. Like, you can see it's not the softest cable. But it's generally pretty well behaved. I think it's pretty attractive. I think it's the right level of thickness where it is a little bit extra thicker versus your average earphone cable, but it's not overly so. It's not excessive. And to be honest, it's just a really quite nice looking cable, but then it's also got some pretty nice functionality. So you can see down here with the Y split, and this is a thing that Moondrop pretty typically makes large and just kind of unnecessarily unwieldy. Here it's actually pretty nice. They've also got a chin slider, which is functional, like it pretty much stays in place, which is nice. And then of course you've got your preformed ear hooks and your 2-pin connectors like you do on pretty much any other Moondrop earphone. Let me unwind this a little bit, punch in on that, and just quickly demonstrate the 2-pin connector, which is slightly recessed on the Kato, but yeah, I don't know, just generally really pretty happy with this cable. Again, it is a little bit on the stiff side. You can kind of see it springing itself up here, but for the most part, I'm just really happy with this cable, and I think it looks nice on the earphone. Quite a good match for the earpieces, which I guess will lead us into talking about these earpieces, which yes, they do look a whole lot like the KXXS, especially from this side. And especially in this color. The one distinction that you'll see between this and the KXXS from this view, let's see if I can get it on camera, there is a little bit of lettering here that just says Kato. I believe it says Moondrop Presents or something like that. It's very small print. To be honest, I think it would look better without that print, but that's me being fairly picky. But if you go around to the inside, this is where it's actually a little bit different. You can see that there's some sort of like angular pattern on the inside of the shell. Maybe I'll remove the ear tip so you can appreciate it a little bit better. But yeah, there's an angular pattern on the inside of the shell. It's kind of cool, but I don't know how much you're going to be looking at that. One note is that the the Kato, it actually comes in 2 different colors. So this is their stainless steel color, which looks a lot like the KXXS, but it also comes in a matte silver finish. And with that matte silver finish, interestingly, the angular aspects, especially on the inside, but also on the outside, but the angular edges are actually a lot more apparent. And I think it has to do with the fact that these polished stainless steel models are actually like hand polished, and I have a feeling that just has the effect of kind of smoothing out the edges of that angular pattern. But I don't know. Why am I talking this much about an angular pattern? It's the only difference. Otherwise, it's frankly a KXXS. And that honestly carries through into the fit, which I guess I'll do a quick demonstration of right now. Generally, I think this is a pretty nice fitting IM. Kind of, it's very much, if you've used the Starfield, the KXXS, or the Aria, this will not be a revelation or anything different. It is the exact same fit, honestly. Although, I do think that the spring tips improve the fit a little bit. So generally, like, it plugs in easy. You can see that it doesn't require a lot of fiddling. It doesn't take up a ton of space in my concha bowl. Generally a very comfortable earphone. If I have any complaints about the fit and the ergonomics in general, it's just not the most secure fitting IM, and frankly, I find that to be true. I don't know I don't know if this is a dynamic driver thing or something, but I kind of find that to be true of most single dynamic driver earphones that I've tried. Like most of the most secure fitting IEMs are going to be, kind of that semi-custom molded design that tends to come with hybrids and especially all balanced armature sets. So here with the Kato, I would say fit security was fine, but if you're, talking or sleeping or chewing, stuff like that can disrupt the seal, break the seal. It's a little bit better here with the Kato versus the other Moondrop earphones because of these spring tips, which maybe a quick punch in on those so you can appreciate them. These are nicer for sealing, but doesn't completely solve the fact that this is just otherwise not the most secure fitting IEM. And I think that's about as much as I want to talk about the physical aspects here of the Kato. So let's just go ahead and dive into talking about the sound here. And like I will typically do, I will start by talking about just the sound signature to give you a sense of what kind of flavor of sound it's going for. And if you haven't already, check out the frequency response in squig.link. Again, link in the description down below. But the general tuning here it's very familiar, frankly. I would describe this as kind of a mild, tasteful V shape. It's got a generally contrasty sound. The middle of the frequency response range is definitely not the emphasis. We're talking about the mid-range. But what you do have here as the emphasis is you've got a fairly moderate bass boost. I would say definitely not an excessive bass boost. This is not like a bass head's IEM, but this is a very satisfying amount of bass boost that is, I would say mostly situated into the sub bass, but it does also extend into the mid bass, which gives it a little bit of that thumpiness in addition to sort of that low end rumble. And then I think also maybe worth calling out is that even though the top end, if you're just comparing frequency responses, the upper mid range treble region of the Kato looks a lot like, frankly, the frequency response that you will see on the KXXS, the Starfield, the Aria, etc., etc. But interestingly, I found that this one actually comes across a tad brighter. So you do have a little bit of emphasis there in, I want to describe kind of like the mid treble, lower treble. You got that low end emphasis, and then you've got, a decent amount of sort of the vocals being pushed forward in that upper mid range, but then otherwise the rest of the mid range takes a little bit of a backseat. So that's the general sound signature here. Let's talk about what do I like about the Kato. So generally that tonality that I just described, I think it's really hard to hate. I think that is a tonality that's going to work for a lot of people. And frankly, I find it very pleasant. Like there's no real oddities in the tonality. Vocals come across with natural tone. Like there's no goofy nasaliness or anything like that. They don't sound totally recessed or anything. Just the general tuning here is well done. And frankly, I could say the same thing. A lot of what I've said right now, I could say about the KXXS, the Starfield, and the Aria. But the Kato, I think, is actually a big step up, a very significant step up in, I'm just going to call it definition, okay? I think the bass hits here on the Kato are tighter. They've just got a sharper initial attack that gives a sense of physicality to the bass here that I frankly don't get on the other Moondrop earphones. It's also just a little bit tighter in general in that it doesn't seem to smear up the mid-range presentation. Again, this is not a mid-range focused IEM, and the bass I do find masks the mid-range a little bit, but it's not so much from a smearing effect because the bass here feels significantly tighter than it does on the other Moondrop earphones. I think also the treble is got better definition. It just feels more defined. It feels like it's more incisive with like the transient sort of attack on a lot of instruments. So I imagine, a drum snare or even like a guitar pluck, right? A guitar string pluck. You're not plucking the guitar, you're plucking the string on the guitar. But you've got that sort of initial attack of the note that I think the Kato actually does quite a good job with it, and that sort of, again, that definition aspect of the sound. And that combination, right, of the stronger definition in the bass and the treble, it just creates, I think, a stronger sense of weight to the sound, especially percussion. It comes across with just, again, a stronger sense of weight and physicality to it. Kind of similar to something that I was describing with the Dunu Falcon Pro. I think maybe not quite as strong as the Falcon Pro in that sense, or not as physically felt, not as dominant, but it's definitely there. I think kind of along the same lines, I think imaging of the Kato is stronger than the imaging of the other Moondrops. I'm going to stop naming them all. And just generally, I think it gives the Kato a more technical sound that complements the rounded tonality that you get here. Whereas the other Moondrop earphones, I found that they were really well tuned, that could appeal to a lot of people, but they just didn't really have sort of that technical bite to them. And the Kato, I think, frankly, quite well delivers on that. It gives you a nice sense of detail and transparency in the bass and treble. It's well-rounded, but unlike the other Moondrops, I think it's not boring. So that's the stuff that I like here about the Kato, frankly, quite a lot. But maybe what are the things that I don't love about the Kato? And frankly, this is going to be quite a little. There's not a lot that I don't love about it, but let's talk about it. Let's see. Frankly, I think imaging here is better, a lot stronger than it was on the other Moondrops. But the one area where the Kato is not really excelling too much is in sort of the head stage, sound stage, we'll call it that. It still feels a little bit narrow and a little bit claustrophobic in my head. Again, I think the definition and the separation and the layering is actually all there. It just feels a little bit narrow, especially when we compare it to some other earphones, which we're going to get into a little bit more in detail. And then the tonality that I described here as being really good all-rounder and also a little bit contrasty. For my preferences, I think it's a little bit too contrasty. It does add to that definition, but I feel like it does come at the expense of the mid-range, which I already alluded to this a little bit. But I do find that the treble emphasis and the bass emphasis do come at the expense of kind of masking detail in the mid-range. The bass, frankly, again, the bass is nice and tight. The treble is nice and tight. They both feel, appropriately well detailed. But the mid-range is probably where this is, frankly, the weakest. This is not a mid-range focused sound. And for my taste, that means that it's not hitting all of my requirements, but that's okay. And then the last thing that I will mention is that some people, and this is mostly a warning, this is not so much a complaint from my side, but just kind of a warning to folks out there. I do find that the treble emphasis here, again, it's like, especially if you're looking at a frequency response, like it's unclear to me why this sounds brighter than the other earphones, but some people might find the treble on this a tad on the sharp side. Like, frankly, I had no issues with sibilance or anything like that, but certain wispy sounds like hi-hats on drums or even like kind of really high frequency electronic sounds can have a bit of a kind of a razor edge on the Kato that I think sounds pretty nice with, as sort of a self-professed treble head. I like that extra definition, but just kind of a warning to folks out there that that could be maybe a tad fatiguing. So that is what I think of the Moondrop Kato. And before we give this thing a score, let's talk about how this thing stacks up to a handful of other single dynamic driver earphones that are my favorites in the price range. And this in the price range is a pretty broad category because, well, these are all actually priced pretty differently. But yeah, let me actually go ahead and introduce them. So Moondrop Kato, $190. Here we have the Tangent Hana 2021. I believe it's $180, $10 cheaper. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's right. Here we've got the Dunu Falcon Pro. This is $220. And then here we have the JVC FDX1, which I believe is $250. So again, not all the same prices, but as we're going to talk about here and as we get into the details, there's a lot more that's different about them than just that relatively small difference in the pricing. So let's compare these things on tonality. And I'm going to warn you up front, like I think I'm not going to rank these at this point because they all have something to offer in different ways, and I'll try and describe it in a way that you can kind of make up your own mind. I mean, I don't know. I appreciate the tuning of all these for different reasons. So here with the Kato, right, we already talked about this, a mild V-shaped sound signature. I think it's well balanced. It's contrasty. It's got solid bass and treble definition. That is how I would describe the tuning here. The FDX1, the JVC FDX1, this in contrast is actually pretty different. This is a lean neutral sound signature. It makes it so that the mid-range is a lot easier to appreciate, but it does have I would say, a lack of body, especially in comparison to the other earphones here. Fairly light on bass, frankly. The Tangent Hana 2021, I think, actually has a lot in common here with the Kato in terms of its tuning. I would also describe it as a mild V-shaped sound signature. I would also describe it as very balanced and a tuning that's going to appeal to pretty much everybody. But the difference is, I would say this is actually a smidge bit bassier and has a little bit less treble emphasis. And then finally over here to the Falcon Pro. This is the one, if I were to rank these in terms of tuning, this would be the one that's probably the lowest on my scale, just because it's the most colored sound signature. And again, they're all different. They all offer different things, and I think different people will prefer each one. But the Falcon Pro I would describe as kind of a warm V-shaped sound signature. It is fairly dominant in the mid bass, not to the point that it becomes muddy or anything like that. The mid bass on this is actually like the reason that you would be interested in this earphone. It's a really good mid bass presentation, frankly, and it's, you know, because that mid bass is still, you know, well controlled, and there is some treble emphasis. This still actually has, you know, pretty good sense of clarity. In fact, I would say all of these have a really strong sense of clarity, if that's the narrow band of what you're looking for. But that is how I would compare them on tonality. Kind of interested, if you're watching now live, which of those tonalities sounds more appealing to you? Maybe you haven't heard each of these 4 earphones, but just based on my description, which one sounds more appealing and why? I'm interested to see what you guys say. But we will now dive into comparisons on technicalities, which is this is an even broader category. And frankly, I'm also not going to rank them in terms of technicalities because, again, I think some of them excel in different areas, and it's frankly hard for me to say that this one's better than that one in technicalities because it's better in certain aspects, but maybe not in other aspects. So I think better to just kind of dive into and talk about how they differ and where they excel. So the Kato. I think in terms of technical performance, it's quite good. It's got great definition, especially in the bass and the treble. I think the mid-range detail is a little bit lacking. That's the one knock against it here. Like, there's just not a lot of room for the mid-range and that micro contrast in the mid-range and vocals and stuff like that. Not the strongest here. But the bass tightness, the treble tightness and the sharpness, I think, frankly, it makes the sound like really pretty satisfying. It makes it have, I think, pretty solid imaging, but maybe a little bit narrow on the head stage. The JVC FDX1, I don't think it's any stronger in the head stage, frankly. It's, again, pretty decent in an imaging, and it's got a really nice sense of definition, but it does it very much differently. And frankly, I think the definition here is maybe a little bit more evenly distributed in the bass region, where, again, not a bassy earphone. It does have a really nice physicality that is quite addicting for a bass light earphone. The treble also has really quite good definition. I forgot a word there, but there you go. But I think really the standout here is going to be in the mid-range presentation, the micro contrast. When you're listening to vocals, you really get a sense for the texture and the quality and the nuances in that part of the frequency response. If that's not what you care for, well, you might not care about this, because this is a fairly lean sounding earphone, again, especially in comparison to these here. But in terms of technical performance, I think that is where this thing is strongest. And frankly, it's one of the strongest in that sense for pretty much any single dynamic driver earphone that I've ever heard. Okay, so that is those 2 earphones. Let's move on to the Tangent Hana 21, and where this thing is really quite exceptional in the technical performance is in that head stage and imaging performance. It is really quite addicting here on the Hana. It's the same as the old Hana and here on the new Hana. In fact, the old Hana might have been a little bit better in this aspect, but that is neither here nor there. In comparison to these, like, it's actually pretty interesting. Given the fact that their frequency responses look so much the same, how big the difference is between them in terms of the sound presentation, where the Kato feels a lot more just kind of incisive and precise and maybe controlled. The Hana, in comparison, just sounds really big, kind of impressive in a sense, but maybe a little bit less sharp. It's again pretty interesting. I think there's, again, a little bit more bass emphasis here, but for the most part, the Yeah, I don't know. I do think the bass on the Kato is a little bit tighter and punchier, but again, like, you get the stronger sense of depth here from the Hana, which is really interesting. Again, especially considering how similar these are in terms of frequency response. Now, finally, the Dunu Falcon Pro. This has of the bunch here the strongest bass punch. The bass tuning is not so much in the sub bass, although the sub bass honestly is not lacking here. But really, it's about that mid bass punch, and what that really does is it gives it this really strong sense of physicality. If you're listening to music that has kick drums in it, and like, you're gonna feel it in a sense that I think the Kato does an okay job of, and this to a lesser degree, but it's really pretty standout here. It's just got this sense of heft in general to the sound. The treble, I would say, is probably less controlled versus the Kato, but it does have kind of a similar level of definition and incisiveness to it that, again, it's just kind of, it helps keep that mid-bass focus sounding from sounding overly thick and warm and soupy or anything like that. Again, pretty sharp on definition and stuff like that. So I think that's going to about do it for my comparisons and just about everything I've got to say about the Kato. And again, if I forgot something, please ask me a question in the live chat. But otherwise, I'm ready to give this thing a score. Like, honestly, I just think the Kato is a really well-rounded earphone that you could have said about the other Moondrop earphones as well. But what I couldn't have said about those other Moondrop earphones is that the Kato has really good definition, and it's really satisfying in sort of that ASMR way that I really like in my audio. So for that, look, it's beautiful, good package, great cable. I love pretty much everything about that. Frankly, I got to give this thing 1, 2, 3, 4, all 5 of my stars. The Moondrop Kato for 190 bucks. This is definitely one of the top picks at this price range. I think the Tonstum Hana, hopefully, I gave a little bit of a comparison there on what each one excels at. These are both, like, really, in my opinion, pretty exceptional options at around 200 bucks. Which one you want? It's like, do you want kind of the more controlled, buttoned down, more defined sound signature of the Moondrop Kato, or do you want maybe the more impressive head stage and stronger imaging performance of the Hana? It's maybe a little bit more smoothed over. I leave that to you. But if you're interested in checking out the Moondrop Kato, again, shout out to Hi-Fi Go. There's a link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, interesting, you learned something, you like my beard, I don't know, hit the like button. It really does help me out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ding the YouTube bell. And if you're not here live and you're looking for the live Q&A, I have cropped it out and made it a separate video that is linked in a pinned comment down below. But if you are here live, stick around and let's have a chat. Have a good one.